and welcome back to the Premier Injuries Podcast, where we discuss all things to do with injuries in the Premier League. We'll give you the insights into player injuries with knowledge on return times, and of course we cut through rumour or misinformation. This will be at the same time every Thursday through the season, so if you have any inquiries, you can comment below or tweet any of us. And also, before we get into the analysis, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We've got so much good content on here. Like and share the video as well, because it helps us out and it gets all the information out into the community as well. But throwing it to you, Raj, across the pond, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Other than not being able to watch Carabao Cup, I'm doing quite well. Appreciate it.
I mean, do you want to watch the Carabao Cup, though? I've always been in the mind that I don't think it should exist, but that's quite a controversial comment there. Raj,
On balance, I don't care for it. But for me, it's just, especially with, when you're building a team, you wanted to see the patterns of play, right? So I think all those games are important to see.
Yeah, no, I get you in that aspect, to kind of see if it's coming together for certain teams or not. And Ben, I mean, are you sad that you're missing out on the Carabao Cup, or do you share my dislike for it just adding unnecessarily to the schedule?
Well, one, Newcastle aren't in, so two, I couldn't give a damn.
But in general, are you good? Are you feeling well, happy?
Do you know what? Can you not tell? I'm extremely happy. I want to kick off the show. I mean, look, Raj is a YouTube superstar in his own right. However, us minnows, us menials, we're going to need to celebrate. We've hit that 1K subscriber mark. Jesus.
Nice,
I mean,
nice.
At this rate, we're probably going to hit 100K by the time I'm about 155. But, small steps. So yeah. I think it deserves a mention, and we need to mark this momentous time in the Premier Injuries YouTube channel.
I mean, probably in years to come, we'll look back at this moment after me, you and Raj are on a beach somewhere. Like yeah, we're just like that. And we'll turn to each other and say, do you remember when we thought 1K was a milestone? And, whatever happens from that point. But we do have some discussion points to hopefully increase subscriber counts, view counts, whatever. And I think the big one going into last game week was the full disclosure from managers. There seems to be almost a problem once again for those in the community in terms of Fantasy Premier League, but also for fans just in general who might just want to know how their team is going to line up for the weekend. There seems to be a little bit of, skullduggery, not honesty. Ben, do you want to talk us through the kind of differing approaches that you've seen from managers?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it'd be good as well to hear Raj's perspective on how things across the pond in terms of disclosure and updates are handled and managed a little bit differently. But every now and again, we do have a few high-profile injuries in the Premier League that seem to slip under the radar. And there is, literally nothing that is known officially in terms of team news updates before those team sheets drop. Now, the two main culprits this weekend, and I was caught out from a fantasy perspective because I was expecting Everton to do a bit of a job against Aston Villa. So I went heavy on a couple of Toffee's players, only to find out that Richarlison, Jordan Pickford and Seamus Coleman were all omitted from the starting 11. There had been absolutely no indication whatsoever, although those that have maybe watched the game against Burnley on the Monday night may have had some suspicion that Richarlison had picked up a knock. Now, again, Rafa, even before kickoff, wouldn't be pinned down to any kind of timeline or time frame on when these players could be back. But, he's sort of blanketed by saying 2 to 3 weeks minimum. We presume for all of them. Realistically, I suggest that it would be before the international break, particularly for Richarlison. And that occurred with that tackle from James Tarkowski that went unpunished, and it was cause for much debate. And the reason I'm thinking Richarlison won't be rushed back is, you keep him out of the limelight. He's already missed a few games, and you just mitigate any problems that you're going to have with the Brazilian Football Federation, the upcoming internationals, quarantine, self-isolation, so on and so forth. So there's that. And then also there was a bomb dropped on Sunday with the Chelsea match, and that was the absence of Edward Mendy from the Chelsea starting lineup. And that was a last kick in the game against Zenit in the Champions League. Thomas Tuchel and managers like to dress this one up. We thought we had a chance. It was so. We'd give him every opportunity, but in our last session, he just couldn't prove it. What a load of bollocks. We've talked about this before with Pep. You managers who spend probably every waking minute of your day thinking about your team, your players, knowing when they go to the toilet, how many hours sleep, who they're sleeping with, who they're not sleeping with. But all of a sudden, you're looking to pick your team on a weekend and, oh, wow, I didn't realize he's injured. How well, man? We talk about smoke and mirrors. If you're going to at least be truthful and just say, well, you know what? I didn't want to tell you. Why should I? I don't have to. I'm under no obligation. Why would I give the opposition any kind of advantage? Why would I let them plan, prepare? I'd have a lot more respect for managers if they came out and done that. But I understand, Raj, in the US, things are slightly different in how those injury updates are managed.
Yeah, it's really dependent on the sport. So, for example, NHL is the worst. They'll literally say, they'll just give you region, lower body injury, and that's it. If they want to, they'll give you head injury. That's it. Like very, very Pep-like. NFL tends to vary. NFL, to me, the National Football League, American Football League, is the most similar to the Premier League in that some teams will give you a lot more detail, but there's a lot of smoke and mirrors when it still comes to hiding player injuries for a long time. For example, last year, Tom Brady had a torn MCL, I think, for the last 6 weeks of the season. It never got out, and they never even put it on the injury report. And because that would give the opponent, right, an advantage, knowing he's limited in certain movements, or maybe even going after his knee a little bit, right? That's just how it happens. And so I think the NBA tends to be the most detailed when it comes to injuries, but that again is still very, very team dependent. But yeah, it varies. But in general, I would certainly say that there tends to be in the main leagues outside of the NHL, there's probably more detail given than there is from the Premier League. And it's interesting because, I think the most detail I ever see is La Liga. These guys give like very, very detailed, like they don't even care about player privacy. They just give you everything. And so it's just interesting seeing the difference.
Well, I was going to ask both of you this. Does it really make that much of a difference tactically for teams lining up? Kind of going into the weekend, they probably make provisional plans for if player X, player Y is absent. But also something that you've said to me before, Ben, is that these players message each other, they hang around with each other. A lot of teams, England players will message each other just at the weekend and they'll go, oh, how's so-and-so doing? So a lot of these people actually know that people are injured anyway. What is the reason for this? It seems almost like theatre rather than actual utility to it.
Yeah, look, to me, it only serves as deceiving the supporters, the fans, the people that care, maybe the media. Maybe they want to keep that in-house. Maybe they want to release this exclusive news through their own media channels, drive track. Everything these days is clickbait, is money, is revenue. And I suppose keeping it in-house as a priority is a good way and a good move of making sure that the information that's coming out through their directive, those proper channels. Other than that, I don't really see any, big, or the rationale behind making any of these decisions. Am I right in thinking, Raj, that the disclosure in the US is tailored around those gambling laws and how they in betting and how they want teams to disclose, therefore they want to remove that element of that gambling so everybody's on a level playing field?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially I think in the last couple of years with kind of gambling becoming more legalized, that's certainly become a focus is to alleviate, like you said, that difference in making a more even playing field so you don't have that insider knowledge base. And that's certainly one factor. I think in the Premier League, the reason they do it for better or for worse, the PR, control the message as best as you can. I think sometimes it actually hurts them because now you have fans who are just kind of left out in the dust and you have players playing or not playing and there's no information given. So for me, I personally think tends to backfire because I don't see anyone in La Liga being like, oh, we gave out too much information and it was an issue. I've never seen, any club ever think that. So I think it's still just rooted in that sense of kind of, that tradition of not telling as much as you can. But like you said, there's really no reason for it
Yeah.
anymore. So it's like, let's shift the paradigm.
Yeah, I tell you, you touch upon a great point actually, and this was brought about at the beginning of the season. Now, we've all heard the rumours. Gylfi Sigurdsson dropped off the face of the earth. No updates from the club. Nobody really officially knows what's going on, other than that he wouldn't be involved. The club did release an update, never named an individual. It coincided with Fabian Delph actually being withdrawn from the squad and away from the training pitches after testing positive for COVID. A guy with a family, and all of a sudden he was thrust into the limelight for the wrong reasons. And even then, clubs, nobody came out and said it was up to the player himself and said, I know what's going on, but I'm actually I tested positive and I'm self-isolating. And it, like I say, it doesn't reflect against the clubs well at all. Because, the Twitter rumor mill, the social media channels these days, they're always going to go into overdrive. That's just the world we live in.
And I think one of the also most interesting things is Marcelo Bielsa tried to experiment with being as honest as possible, the most honest manager. And he was punished for it from a terrible reaction there. He was one of the managers to try and break the mould. Obviously, in the Championship, he broke the mould a little bit as well in terms of the Spygate thing. But yet, again, he hadn't actually broken any rules, but he was fined for whatever reason. But it's interesting that the only manager of recent times, I don't know if you know any more, Ben, that have tried this, but he was releasing his first 11. He was being absolutely honest with his news. And then all of a sudden, he got a rafter of abuse. And now he's shut up shop as well. And he's gone from one of the most open to one of the most mysterious managers now in the Premier League. I mean, do you think that we will see anytime soon where the Bielsa tactic might be adopted more? Or is tradition just going to live on?
I don't know. There's one manager in my, I suppose, in all of the time that I've been working in and around the sport, there's one manager that has named a starting 11 that hasn't been Marcelo Bielsa. I'll put that out to you. Anyone? Bueller, anyone?
I don't know. It's definitely not Pep.
It was Carlo Ancelotti.
Oh.
I'm not 100% certain if it was a Premier League game, but he did announce his 11 during a press conference. It wasn't something that he sort of came out and just announced. He got asked the question and he went, oh yeah, this player's playing. This player's playing. And then before you know it, he was just like, well, I've told you 9, I might as well just tell him he's starting 11. So that's the only one that I ever recall seeing.
I'd be interested to see as well. Maybe this is a data dive that I can do, but with Bielsa and that Ancelotti incident, I wonder if the teams lost games more often in games that they were more likely to win in terms of data because they released their team and the other team knew what to do tactically. It would be quite interesting to see that. I think, like we've kind of discussed here, it just seems a little bit of over drama, over centralization, and like you said, the fans are kind of the ones that lose out most of the time. Let's move it though. We've talked about Bielsa. We've talked about him in the past, but in the present, Leeds are going through quite a few problems with injuries. Ben, can you talk us through what the main problems are there?
Main problems tend to be at the back. Already did they go up to the game at St James's Park last Friday without Diego Llorente, a muscular problem. Robin Koch has been managing a pelvic issue all season. And then, of course, we had the dismissal of Pascal Struijk, whose red card they failed to have overturned for his tackle on Harvey Elliott. Then added to that, we also seen Luke Ayling limp off towards the end, which is a concern, because when we're talking about hardy players, then Luke Ayling certainly is the one. I think he played all but 20 minutes in the Premier League last season. Yes, year on year, 3,000 plus minutes in the league. So, if he does pick up knocks, it never tends to be anything, really serious. And he is a major concern heading into this weekend. In fact, I can never categorically state, but if you were to ask me, could he make this weekend, I would have to say no. There is better news with regards to Patrick Bamford. Sources close to the player said that he is confident of shaking off this ankle injury. It was caused with a collision with Manquillo, which ultimately forced him off as well. It didn't look too serious, but my understanding is he was rested as a precaution in the Carabao Cup. So fingers crossed Patrick Bamford should be okay. But Bielsa, when asked specifically about those players, it depends on he loves to say the evolution of the injury. Yeah, right. Well, so Bamford, good chance. Ayling, not so good. Koch and Llorente aren't too far away. That would obviously be a big boost to that Leeds backline. Of course, given the amount of time they've been out, they are going to lack that little bit of sharpness and that fitness, particularly in the Leeds style of play, that basketball, that cut and thrust and high energy. So that might be a worry. One glaring omission from any updates is Rafinha. Now, there was a lot of talk that he was going to miss the game on Tyneside last weekend. He did travel with the squad. There was some suggestion that it was a hip injury. He had actually picked up a knee problem in training on the Thursday. And he was forced off with, again, what Bielsa reported as a problem in his hip. A fairly generic term. We don't really, he was moving all right. He obviously got his goal on Tyneside, wasn't involved midweek. No updates, and I'm presuming and I'm hoping that no news is good news on that front. That we could expect him to be in that Leeds squad this weekend.
I wanted to throw it to you, Raj, on this subject with Leeds, though. Similar kind of start to their last season, lots of injury problems at the beginning. Could this be due, as Ben said, their very intense style of play? Could Leeds almost be put in an unlucky or unnatural position that their style of play is actually hindering their season?
Yeah, I mean, we already know when the season starts, there's that transition from off season to preseason to real season. There's already increased injury risk for any team. And now you add in, Bielsa's high intensity style, so you're putting more demands on each of the players. And then as you have players getting injured, they're in a pick up fitness deficit. So when they come back, you're at more risk. And then further, the players behind them may not be as match fit because they haven't been playing, as many minutes, right? So it starts that cycle. And Bielsa never tends to change his playing style. So you have that aspect as well. So it just becomes that vicious cycle when it comes to these high press, high intensity teams.
And kind of throwing it to you, Ben, does the data kind of back this up, that a lot of it is muscular injuries, kind of ones from overplaying rather than for other reasons?
I mean, that was a point that I was going to make. We do need to contextualize this, and we need to be very keen to ensure that you don't just blanket every injury the same, contact and non-contact. Like, for example, the Patrick Bamford ankle. Football is a contact sport. The Luke Ayling knee injury. If you don't want to get injured in football, don't play, first and foremost. But what we would say historically, and player availability and minutes are a really good indication about how the players can tolerate the style of play under Bielsa. Typically, Leeds manage a very small squad, probably one of the smallest squads in the Premier League, maybe only akin to Wolves in their first 2 seasons coming up from the Championship. So he doesn't tend to use a lot of players because inherently, those he's able to manage those players quite well. And look, there's going to be problems and spikes early season, particularly during that period of adaptation, because no matter how much work you do off the field, once you're thrust into that competitive environment, thrust in front of the cameras, thrust in front of the crowds again for the first time, Old Trafford, Manchester United, Liverpool, some of not only the best teams in the Premier League, but in Europe and in the world. Players, you want to go out on the biggest stage and you want to perform against the best players. You want to test yourself. So, you're willing to put in those extra hard yards. You're willing to push yourself that little bit harder. And sometimes, maybe the body isn't in a place to be able to cope with, that extra demands being placed upon it.
Everton are another team that are going through kind of similar injury problems. Ben, again, can you give us like a quick update on their players and an insight into that?
If Rafa's to be believed.
Like we did at the top of the show.
Yeah. Richarlison, Pickford and Coleman, I wouldn't expect to see any of those players back before the international break. They talked about 2 to 3 weeks minimum. So it would be a risk, particularly Coleman, ongoing hamstring issues. We've seen a couple of problems in the Carabao Cup with Lucas Digne and Andre Gomez. Gomez, not so much of a concern because he's been on the fringes of that team, but they were both replaced, what Rafa said, as a precaution due to tightness or a little bit discomfort in the calf. Digne obviously would be a big one. He's an integral part of their play. Fabian Delph, dislocated shoulder again. No timeline on that, but it could be. My original assessment, potential return to play, was maybe post-international break, but that may be extended a little bit longer, possibly into November as things aren't progressing as we had hoped. And Dominic Calvert-Lewin, again, we're in and around that international break period. Couple of issues, thigh and toe. If results keep on continuing, the way they're going for Everton, Calvert-Lewin is maybe one that I could possibly see thrown back in there around what would be game week 7. But like I say, I'm gonna coin Raj's favorite term. It's all about risk and reward.
I do love that phrase, risk and reward. In terms of it then, I think we've covered the Everton injuries. So we're going to go into the last discussion point of this game week. And Raj, I want you to open up on this one because Pep had a rant this week. Not unlike him, he does love to go off sometimes on certain subjects. But this one was about 5 substitutes. He was saying that it's unfair, that the Premier League doesn't have that other leagues do. And one of the kind of comments about this that some people have said is other leagues have done the 5 substitutes. We saw Lille win the league last season. We saw Atletico win the league last season. It's not benefited the big clubs as much as some people might have thought. People thought the 5 substitutes would make them run away with the league. So are you kind of actually with Pep in that situation, or do you think he should just get on with it because he's got one of the biggest squads in Europe?
No, I'm definitely with him. And I've said it since the start of it that I think the rewards of player health, and not just for the big team, for the small teams, far outweighs the idea that you can put in, having more depth. A team with a bigger roster can put 5, fresh subs in. I think it actually might matter more for smaller clubs because if a player gets injured in their starting 11, like we just touched on Leeds, right, who play with a very small roster. So them losing one player to injury because let's say they weren't able to take him out, right, has a much bigger impact than a city losing that same player. So that's where the subs rule can come in handy for smaller clubs. So to me, the incremental value of having 5 subs because you have a bigger roster is much less than the incremental value of being able to sub players out because they're playing too many minutes. And I think that's where my rationale has been since since the start, and I don't really see why not.
And just to remind people, we actually interviewed Mark Gillette, head doctor of the Premier League. There's a link on screen now, so do watch that video because he explained his reasoning and the Premier League's reasoning as to why there wasn't a rule change. But just quickly throwing it back to you, Raj, in terms of it then, do you think that not only should it be for this COVID situation, but going forward forevermore, there should be 5 substitutes?
Forever is tough to say, but I would say at least for the next 2 to 3 seasons, because you have the shortened season, and then you have the World Cup that's being moved. So you have AFCON that's being moved. You also, obviously, we just had Euros and then Copa this past summer, right? So you have a very condensed schedule and knock-on effect for the next 1, 2, 3 seasons. And so I think during that period, player health and safety needs to be prioritized.
Ben, what do you think though? Big squads, big problems, or do you think that it's been overplayed?
I take on board everything that's said, the discussion points raised, and from the outside looking in, it looks to be a clear and obvious decision. I actually spoke to Mark, so Chief Medical Officer, and I've actually worked with the Premier League in supplying some of the data in and around injuries, particularly around Project Restart and that season in particular. And obviously they were open on board to implementing changes around the 5 substitutes, around the drink breaks, and so on and so forth. So it was something that they were open and willing to bring to the table. But my understanding, now this comes from the actual managers and the clubs, within who involved in the league, any decision to bring that to the board was almost vetoed because a certain number of managers just didn't want to entertain the fact that they wanted 5 substitutes. And that took that decision out of their hands. So it never really got to the table. And that happened not just once, not twice, but on 3 separate occasions. So, ultimately, the league understood the situation and were willing to bring this to the table if it was if the league's teams, those stakeholders, could come to some agreement. But unfortunately, it wasn't, and therefore the hands were pretty tied with that. And data-wise, we haven't seen that massive glut of injuries maybe that everybody was expected. Certainly Project Restart, it didn't. And in fact, if anything, we actually seen a little bit of a downturn. The reasons as to why that happened, we can't, specifically put it down to one thing. It could be a culmination of the substitutes to drinks break, but also, was it the fact that maybe there was no crowds in the stadium? Was the intensity just not there? The weather, we were playing in the summer as well. So, and players were coming off the back of an extended break, and they maybe weren't able to undertake that sports specific conditioning that they would ordinarily, but players were able to maintain good base levels of fitness while they were away from the game. So look, I can understand why the argument's for, and maybe, if you would ask some of those managers again who initially vetoed the move, Steve Bruce being one of them at Newcastle, and a point that Raj actually raised, those teams with the smaller squads found themselves being overstretched, and almost becomes a vicious circle where your hand is forced to play high profile, high status players who are maybe in that so-called red zone because of the importance of the game, where you would ideally you would like to take them out of the firing line or reduce minutes in the game, but for whatever reason that just isn't possible.
Would you say that this is almost the small clubs of the Premier League cutting off their nose to spite their face? Like, they don't want to possibly give an advantage to the big teams, so they'd rather cut out any possible improvements to their squads as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was a point that was raised. The 2 big proponents of against it were Steve Bruce and Chris Wilder, who, funny enough, had quite extensive injury problems. Squads were fairly strained and were working at capacity. So, if you had have asked them later on in the season, they might have had a change of belief and maybe would have pushed for those 5 substitutes. And maybe, decisions like that may, it may have cost Chris Wilder his job and ultimately Sheffield United's place in the top tier of football.
I mean, throwing this back to you, Raj, why were the club managers making this decision, though? I mean, this is a medical issue. Should it have been taken out of the hands of the managers who obviously they want to safeguard their players, but at the end of the day, it's a results-based business. Should it have been handed to the medical staff who would have probably made a decision for the welfare of the players?
Yeah, but I mean, that brings up a whole other topic, right? And so we know that medical teams don't really have full autonomy. There's a lot of different kind of decision makers that come into play, and we see this all the time. So in an ideal world, of course, medical teams would have full autonomy, and and some staffs have more autonomy than others, right? But at the end of the day, when something does go wrong, it's typically the manager who falls in the sword. So I understand why some who think it may give them a competitive disadvantage would be so staunchly against some of those things.
I just to touch on a point that you raised there. Should it been taken out of the hands and a decision made by the Premier League medical team? The data doesn't support the fact, first and foremost, and yes, it may not be as robust as maybe the data could be, because it would never be, but certainly in terms of looking year-on-year comparisons and like for like, there was nothing in there to suggest that something dramatic needed to change. Things pretty much ticked along as they always had done. Yes, we've seen a slight increase in the number of time loss absences, but actually the number of average days missed across injuries generally were reduced. Now, that in itself was maybe a little bit of an indication that managers and coaches were maybe looking to managing their squads a little bit better, as in terms of rotation and bringing players in and out, as opposed to just relying on, well, actually we'll save a few 10, 15 minutes here or there by substituting players in and out. So, there wasn't really a lot for the Premier League to force something through.
Do you think, though, that no glut of injuries, no data to back it up, the obvious kind of thing from the outside for me is, did players and teams adjust their style and pace of play? We've talked extensively about how maybe Nuno Espirito Santo did that at Wolves. Potentially that cost him his job there. I mean, is it a fair data set then to say that there's no kind of link, because that might have been removed from a fair data set because they've reduced the pace of play?
I mean, look, if you wanted to overlay running metrics, high intensity sprints, distance covered, possibly, then maybe that would give a little bit of insight and tell a different kind of story. Ultimately, there's one loser in all of this, and it's the fans and its supporters, and it's that value, because even on the eye test, players weren't performing at optimal levels, and that leaves supporters and fans shortchanged in their expected levels of entertainment. So I think that's a given fact. But yeah, look, managers and clubs and teams would have altered the style of play, but you didn't have the crowds there either, and how much of an impact did that have? The environment and the atmosphere of just pushing a player on. Big derby games, it's difficult. It's a different one. It's difficult to quantify.
I mean, scientifically, far too many variables. I think we're winding up to the end of this week's podcast, though. Any final comments from you, Ben, or from you, Raj?
No, I was going to say the same thing. There's so many open variables right now. There's so many moving variables that it becomes very hard to isolate or discern what's accounting for what. And I think we're going to see that for the next couple of years. And we're coming off a complete outlier event. And we're going to see kind of just unprecedented things. Well, not things, but there's a lot of variables that are hard to quantify. So it's an interesting time in that regard. I think that's the fun of it, personally.
And we shall see. We will keep people up to date with those situations, because here at Premier Injuries and also over at 3CB Performance, just to remind people, do check out Raj there. We will be keeping up to date people with all this vital information, data, with the best sources for it. We don't engage in misinformation, fake news, rumours. This is all the most up-to-date and most accurate information. And that's why I remind people as well to subscribe to the channel, because we've got so much great content over here. But for now, I'm going to wish everybody the best of luck with selecting their teams, whatever they're doing with the Premier League, if they're making bets, whatever they use this information for. And we will see you next Thursday. See you then.